Thorben Simonson is from Denmark. He completed both his bachelor's and his master's degree in social science and health promotion at the Roskilde University in Denmark. He did his PhD at the Department of Organization at the Copenhagen Business School. And during his PhD, Thorben visited the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology as a research fellow, and he defended his dissertation in February 2020. And he's now assistant professor at the Department of Business IT at the IT University in Copenhagen. He's affiliated with the Center for Digital Welfare, and he's a member of the Technologies and Practice Research Group. Thorben's research interests include the architecture of health, the design of novel spaces of care, and the situated implications of the digital in relation to care, work, and organization, as well as questions that are related to place and place attachment. In your invitation that you all got from Elena, you can find 2 links to 2 of his recently published papers. So these papers are very close to the topic that he is going to speak about today. And that is, the title of today's talk is The Spatial Organization of Psychiatric Practice, a Situated Inquiry into Healing Architecture. And I'm now asking Thorben to take over in share screen mode and of course unmuted. And I will instead mute myself.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for that very nice introduction. I hope you can all both hear and see me. I can't see you while I give the presentation because the presenter view only shows me my own PowerPoint screen, which is kind of odd given the fact that I know that 25 people are actually watching me, but I can't see you in return. But first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And as Thomas said, the title of my talk today is The Spatial Organization of Psychiatric Practice, a Situated Inquiry into Healing Architecture, which is also the title of my dissertation that I correctly defended in February, as Thomas also said. So before we get started, I thought I would begin with some propositions, which are first that healing architecture to me and in the work I've done represents a particular effort to spatially and materially organize contemporary psychiatric practice. However, that the problem motivating my inquiries throughout my dissertation are not about how architecture and space mediate health or promote patient recovery, what healing architecture is or what it should be, but rather what it actually does. And here, the subtitle of the dissertation kind of alludes to this attempt, namely to conduct a situated inquiry into healing architecture. So the inquiry is brought to bear on a particular and specific hospital, which is located in the city of Slagelse, which is in the region of Zealand in Denmark. And it was opened in late 2015, whereafter I shortly started conducting my fieldwork. So for me, the Slagelse site or the hospital represents a manifest form of healing architecture. So my work hinges on the fact that I consider the hospital a case of healing architecture, and that I can identify that healing architecture by visiting the site. Okay. So let me jump right into some of my data. This is from an interview I conducted with a head nurse early on in my studies, and let me just read it aloud to you. So the head nurse says, well, In the first instance, it all sounds really nice, and I would have liked more words to have been used by the architects to describe what healing architecture is, because to me, when they say healing architecture, it means a lot. What's actually healing about it? Do they mean the colors? Is it the interior design they mean? Is it the transparency they mean? Well, I don't know, but I can guess that this is perhaps some of what they mean, but I don't know. So it would be unfair if I started to make inferences about it, no? And then I say, well, are there any of the things that you've mentioned that you feel make a difference in any way? And the head nurse says, they make a difference, but I'm not sure that it's healing. So this, to me, takes us into the crux of the matter, that we have a contemporary design with a lot of intentionality built into it, but it's very unclear what it actually means and how it actually comes to matter in practice. So the talk I'm going to give today tries to suggest some answers to that. So the agenda is that I'd like to start with what Lucy Suchman calls some routine trouble, to kind of take you into the ethnographic material that I gathered and to take you into the site. So I just don't talk about it, but actually try to show you some of the tensions that I've tried to follow throughout my work. That will lead me to the main claim that I pose in my dissertation, the research question, my approach, the 3 papers that are to be found within the dissertation, and then I'll end on some closing propositions. So even though I've moved a little bit on, I would say, from some of the work in my dissertation, the talk today will primarily be based on that work. So taking you kind of in medias res, you could say, into it, let me just share this slide. So can you see when I move my mouse on the screen? Yes, okay. So what you're seeing here is a rendering of the inpatient setting where I conducted my fieldwork, which I conducted in 2016 and 2017. And I did approximately about 200 hours of ethnographic fieldwork, divided between shadowing passes and participant observations. And let me just walk you through what it is you're seeing. So the photograph is a picture of part of the site. And the glass cube that you see here is the staff office situated at one end of an inpatient setting. These are the 2 entrances. And down the way to the end are the patient rooms. Each inpatient ward can, at any given time, have 17 hospitalized patients. They're organized as integrated units. And integrated units means that patients who are voluntarily admitted, as well as patients who are admitted against their will, share the same ward. Inside the office space are 3 office spaces. They're used in different ways across the inpatient settings at the hospital. There are 6 of these wards in the hospital. Some use them for conference meetings with physicians having conversation with patients, for instance. And in some wards, they're organized as the head nurse's office or the secretary's office. And the wider office space here is called the dovecote, and it contains most of the nursing staff. So nurses, auxiliary nurses, what we call pedagogues, I'm not sure you would use the same classification, perhaps caretaker or social worker. They all share this kind of open office space. Adjacent to it is this zone or area, which they call the environment. And this is basically where ward life takes place for multiple reasons, which I'll try to speak to in a moment. So the environment is located between the office space and this green courtyard, which is an outside space where most patients use it as a place to go and smoke cigarettes. initially the hospital was organized in a way that restricted smoking, but they quickly found out that it was necessary to ensure a calmer environment. So at the far end, we have two more spaces which are designed as kind of leisurely spaces. So they have sofas and a television set, and the dividing wall here is a folding wall. So they can parcelate the space in two, or they can open it up and have a larger space for leisurely activities. Most of the time, however, during the time of my fieldwork, those spaces were closed off for different reasons as well, but mostly because staff weren't able to see patients. And so the lines of sight here were problematized, and patients also didn't enjoy kind of inhabiting this space because they weren't seen as well. So lines of sight were very important, and staff ended actually up moving a lot of the furniture from this space to this space, which is also why ward life primarily takes place in this small area here, which turned out to be quite important for the types of interactions that staff would have with patients. So I was primarily interested in trying to identify how the space makes a difference, perhaps somewhat stubbornly trying to identify the physical aspect of the space, how it had an impact on the types of interactions patients would have with staff, but also the organization of work that took place inside the dovecote or the office space. So the nursing space, or the nursing station, sorry, the glass cube that you can see here, really functioned as a point of convergence and passage, with staff moving in and out of this door, which according to regulation was supposed to be closed, but would always be open. So patients would kind of hang out in the doorway, and staff would move in and out of the door because this was the most kind of central entry point into getting to encountering patients. So what motivated me, or what directed my line of sight during my fieldwork, was the kind of classic question that Erving Goffman poses in his 1974 book, what is it that's going on here? And the word here was very key for me. It meant that I tried to look at the relations between location and activity. So where did types of interactions happen? So that became a kind of it created direction for my site. Okay, let me move on to the routine trouble I was talking about. So what I tried to do was empirically detail the ongoing work put into the continuous recasting of space and order in practice. And I'd like to take you into a situation with a male patient on one of the wards that I followed. So staff are discussing how to isolate A from the other patients when the chief physician on the ward says he isn't supposed to run around like a madman out there, which perhaps in itself is problematic given the fact that he's actually hospitalized for a reason. But nonetheless, he's kind of running around in the environment space, the kind of open space between the courtyard and the nursing station, in a way that they consider as disorderly. So he's disrupting ward order, as it were. And the head nurse responds to the physician's comment. He uses a lot of square meters. So here is an indication of the fact that he uses the space in a problematic way. So they discuss his situation. Apparently he's not been medicated since the day before, and the issue of his disorderliness remains unresolved. And two nurses discuss if they can place A in the seclusion room, but it's already occupied. Let me just quickly go back and show you. This is the seclusion room, and it's a shared space between two patient rooms. And it's also transparent, so staff can easily have visible access to the activities of a patient in the seclusion room. So typically, there's only one seclusion room, so there was always discussion of which patients should have access to it, which created quite a lot of issues for staff. Okay, so the seclusion room is occupied, and one nurse exclaims, "It's completely insane." Again, the language is perhaps somewhat disconcerting. So she's referring to the fact that in practice, only one patient can occupy the seclusion room, making it a 2-bedroom apartment for one. So the designed intent again becomes problematized in practice. Okay, so they've been discussing where to put A, and his patient room is right across from the dovecote. So they also have visible access to his room, although the doors are not transparent, so he can close the door if he wants to. They're discussing what to do, and between having those discussions, he suddenly comes out of his patient room again. He's taken a shower, he's naked, he's put his clothes on the kitchen table that you see here and across different furniture that are in the courtyard. So he's really disrupting the entire ward population. Two nurses, one of them his contact person, collect him and want to bring him to a conversation with the chief physician who wants to administer medication to him. So the physician is placed in this conference room. She's strategically placed in the corner so she has easy access to the dovecote. I'm shadowing the auxiliary nurse that is his contact person for the day. So I follow her in, and we're situated around the table here. And then A is let into the room here. He's asked by the physician if he would like to take his medication. He uses foul language. He doesn't want to take the medication. And I think after 2 minutes, he leaves the room. The room affords that he can leave it. Although it has a door, it can't be locked. So he's standing here, we're all seated. He leaves the room and he starts kind of pacing up and down the hallways. After a while, he comes back though, and he feels kind of sorry about the language he's used. And he returns, and the physician once again asks him if he would like to take his medication, and tries to explain to him that that would be a good idea. Once again, he disagrees and he leaves again. So there's a temporal order at play here where we're all waiting while all the other patients aren't being considered because focus of attention is directed only to A in this situation. He returns again for a third time. And when she once again tries to probe that he should take his medication, he shouts, "I don't want that medication," and leaves once again, this time without returning. So per protocol, the physician and the two nurses leave the conference space, and they enter the dovecote where they can visually surveil the ward space, and they can kind of keep an eye on what A is up to. And as the arrows indicate, he's still kind of pacing back and forth on the broad hallways here. So they enter the dovecote and they draw in the rest of their colleagues. And one of the nurses says, "We have a situation. I want all the other patients to be taken to their rooms, or else it will become a spectacle. I want you to go into the environment," she instructs two of her colleagues. "No drama, just tell the patients, go to your room." So here, the focus of attention moves slightly away from A and towards the other patients or service users in the hospital. They don't want them to see the situation because they're afraid it'll become a spectacle, but also for safety reasons. They don't want them to meddle in the intervention that they're going to make, and they want to be able to know where everybody is situated. So the two colleagues, they leave the dovecote and ask all the patients to go to their room. And in this instance, they do without further ado. So they just nice and slowly go to their patient rooms, and all the doors are closed. So meanwhile, A is still pacing back and forth here, and they collect him in a different patient room where he's not allowed to be and bring him back to his own patient room. The staff members then also leave the dovecote and join the patient and his contact person, placing themselves or kind of fanning out outside of his patient room. The rooms have double doors, so they can easily make space for that. And he is calmly administered his medication. And the physician asks him, so should I register that it was by coercion? And he rather bluntly, almost smiling, says, well, that's for you to worry about. So kind of the formal organizational protocol of him having to take the medication or them administering to him, he doesn't really care about that. But he's given the medication and they all return to their respective tasks. Okay, so what is it actually that we're observing here? What's going on? The claim that I try to make is that an important point of departure for studying what healing architecture does in psychiatric practice is to direct analytical attention towards the relationships between space and interaction, focusing on the ongoing, iterative, and sometimes precarious processes of ordering in practice. And in the situation I've tried to walk you through now, we see kind of multiple orderings at play, both in terms of the work that the nursing staff and the physician coordinate and gather around, but also the effects of that work. So for instance, when the entire patient population is moved from the environment to their personal spaces, those spaces change characteristics, as it were, from being the patient's individual kind of safe spaces is the way that it's spoken about in design terms. They, in practice, become cells effectively, holding them back from the further situation. So this situation doesn't have those patients' experiences, but I have other material kind of supporting the claim that it's experienced as a holding place. They feel neglected and forgot because they're not told how long they're supposed to stay in there. So they kind of have to wait it out. So the spatial ordering taking place as an effect of the work of administering care to A also has both spatial and temporal effects on the broader, both ward spaces, but also on the broader patient population. So I just want to direct your attention to these three words: space, interaction, and ordering, which are kind of my attempt at analytically grasping what's going on. Let me move on in 1 second. So the point is that spaces don't simply contain activities, but they're irredeemably implicated in both the organization and accomplishment of psychiatric care, as the situation that I tried to walk you through shows. So healing architecture and psychiatric practice are not separate things, but they're mutually constituted. And I would argue that the enacted spaces, for instance, with the patient rooms, are as real as the physical spaces that we can identify. So a key proposition that I'm making is that space and interaction need to be studied as co-constitutive because they make visible, as it were, what healing architecture does or is made to do in situated actions. So in order to try to come closer to this relationship, I tried to develop a repository of sensitive terms, kind of drawing on the notion from Anne-Marie Mott, to help me think about the spatial organization of contemporary psychiatry. So how space and interaction become mutually constitutive can be understood in different ways. So there's not kind of one entry point into trying to understand this relationship. And for that reason, I tried to develop what I call 4 sensibilities into studying the relations between space and interaction. So it's sort of an analytical appropriation, you could say, to gain a differentiated appreciation of the phenomenon question. And the phenomenon question here, of course, is healing architecture. So how is it that we can analytically capture how design spaces actually make a difference in practice? And a starting point for that is that space becomes a topic of inquiry rather than as a resource for analysis. So these are the four sensibilities that I try to develop throughout my dissertation. So while they might be considered distinct, they arguably unite around the idea that space can be understood as both the medium and the outcome of action. And they might not be either nor ontologically or epistemologically congenial towards one another. They are not incommensurable, I would argue at least. So let me just read them out real short. So the first sensibility is that materiality mediates. And I, of course, draw this sensibility, as it were, from actor network theory, and more specifically, the work of Brun-Latour. The second sensibility I draw from symbolic interactionism, specifically the work of Erving Goffman, and that interactional repertoires and staging problems are important, or might be an entry point into trying to understand the relations between space and interaction. And I think the nursing station offers itself as a very good example of that in terms of the glass facades, as you could see on the photograph, creating multiple staging problems for staff when engaging in professional interactions with each other while having patients surveil them, or at least see them perform. And I'll get back to that because it's a key focus in one of my papers. The third sensibility is to follow practical action and the production of order in situ. And this I draw from, well, not from classical ethnomethodology, but from an appropriated version in science and technology studies, specifically from the work of Michael Lynch. So we're trying to follow situated actions and interactions in practice. And the fourth, which perhaps is slightly different than the rest, comes from the work of social anthropologist Mary Douglas, and the idea that systems of classification shape practices of ordering. So she has this really neat analytical lever, you could say, that spatial arrangements are connected to social order. So one of the papers that I've written tries to unpack what she calls the full range of dangers within the setting, which discloses how staff prescribe or ascribe certain values to certain spaces and manage the wards building upon that system of classification. I'll get back to that as well. And this is perhaps something we can also discuss because I guess, as I said, they don't necessarily sit very well with each other, but they're my attempt at staging different approaches to trying to understand the relationship between space and interaction and how they become ordered in practice. Okay, so moving on to the three papers of my dissertation. So what I thought I would do is, rather than kind of deep diving into each paper, I would give you an overview and wrap them up by making some broader propositions that the dissertation also tries to make. So I'll show you what the papers inquire, and then I'll show you afterwards what the kind of key findings of them are. And I can always bring this slide up afterwards when we go into our discussions. Okay, so the three papers are attempts at to stage inquiries into how space and interaction are ordered. So the first paper inquires, how do nursing staff manage what they consider to be danger and disorder within contemporary inpatient settings? And this question is very much drawn from the work of Mary Douglas. So the way that staff consider the spaces has an enormous impact on how they try to manage the spaces as well. So for instance, the two spaces at the back end of the ward were considered as risky spaces. And as a consequence of that, they were locked and shut off. But that then has consequences for where patients move and how they then have to ameliorate the kind of activities that take place elsewhere. The second paper inquires, how do nursing staff react to the healing architecture of an inpatient ward? And what is the mediating role of the transparent nursing station for staff-patient interaction? And here I tried to kind of bring the analytical thrust of actor network theory together with Goffman's insights into staging problems. So considering the nursing station as a an object that mediates the relations between staff and patients, while also considering how staff are left with different staging problems because they are visible to patients. And I might just interject here that I primarily followed staff. So at no point was there kind of an explicit interest in how patients were doing as such in relation to their recovery trajectory, because I have no kind of basis to speak to that. That doesn't mean that I wasn't interested in how they were doing, and I had a lot of conversations with patients about what they were doing, but it was always kind of, for me at least, related to the organization of the space, because it was so articulated as being very important. But I'll get back to that towards the end. And the third paper inquires, how is spatial order accomplished through psychiatric work? And how does this work shape the sense and significance of inpatient spaces? This paper is based on the vignette that I showed you earlier. So you kind of get a sense of the argument that the work towards taking care of A has a tangible effect on the spatial disposition throughout the ward. Okay, so what did I find out? Paper 1, cultural structures are constitutive for the relationship between space and interaction in practice, which is to say that the systems of classification at work, seen from the staff perspective, have an impact on how space and interaction takes place. So a very kind of mundane example could be that in the environment between the courtyard and the nursing station, it was okay to have kind of social conversation. Patients were allowed to talk about hobbies, but as soon as they spoke about their diagnosis or medical condition, they would be, staff would typically kind of intervene in the conversation because that conversation took place, as it were, or it was out of place. So Mary Douglas has this notion of matter out of place, but it became very tangible that the reasons for sanctioning patients for different interactions or activities was very place-oriented. So they could have conversations, a type of conversation in the environment which was suitable there, and another type of conversation was only suitable in a kind of medical space of the conference room. So I argue in the paper that this creates sites of contention because the social order of a ward is openly negotiated. And I try to argue that the kind of open and flexible architecture of the space seems to amplify these sites of contention because it's unclear what the relation between function and space is. Whereas kind of in previous psychiatric architectures with strict parcellations, it was more clear what would take place where. And this is more up in the air, which creates multiple negotiations. Okay, so the second paper, transparency produces an environment of uncertainty and distance rather than intelligibility and closeness. So in the design descriptions, the use of glass partitionings and transparency was thought to produce a sense of safety and comfort on the side of the patients. And the professionals seem to disappear in the architectural descriptions. So it doesn't seem that they've considered what it means for the professional interactions taking place within the nursing station. So what I found out is rather than actually creating this sense of closeness and intelligibility, staff were able to withdraw because they could maintain visible contact, but it didn't create the relation that they thought it would. So it created distance rather than closeness. And uncertainty happened because staff were left speculating about what patients were talking about because they were visible, not audible. And patients likewise would speculate about what staff were doing. So when I was with the patients, they would typically ask me, do you think they're talking about me? Or do you know if they know if my discharge is coming up? And more ethically problematic, when a patient was supposed to get administered a syringe, for instance, that would be visible within the nursing station, but it wouldn't always be knowable who it was for, which would create kind of a sense of disconcertment with the patients. Okay, so this mutual visibility creates stating problems, animating practices of unseeing on the side of the professionals. So they would pretend they didn't see patients, although they were well aware that they were there, creating what we with Goffman might say were non-persons, so not acknowledging their existence. So they would have this kind of continuous disturbance in the nursing station because patients would try to get in contact with them. And being mindful of time, I'll just move a little quicker. So paper 3 finds that the nature of inpatient spaces is transient and that psychiatric work and ward spaces are mutually constitutive. So the idea that a patient room is a safe space depends very much on the practices taking place. Okay, so now I just want to change focus a bit. So this is Winston Churchill, as you might know. And he's kind of been with me throughout this research process. He has this very known quote, which is used and probably also misused and abused, but I thought I'd take it here nonetheless. He said, "First we shape our buildings and afterwards they shape us." So in other words, architecture matters. The quote to me captures a significant tension between the design and development of a building and the subsequent use thereof. So Churchill famously said this in 1943 in relation to the rebuilding of the chamber of the House of Commons due to its previous destruction during the Blitz, so during the Second World War. And he was referring to the importance of kind of retaining or keeping the chamber's adversarial design, which had a very kind of combative rectangular form, which he thought maintained the practice of British parliamentary democracy, essentially. So while this statement indeed does say something about the relationships between buildings, people, and society, it does not, however, represent a fundamental truth about these relationships, which I think my work tries to be a testament to. So I try to kind of sidestep any causal relation there might be between how we design our buildings and how they are taken in use afterwards. So this is a rendition of the psychiatric hospital. And it's been very much framed as a building for recovery, that it's been designed for recovery. And just to give you a little bit of context, currently about 5.5 billion euro is being devoted to the development of hospital facilities in Denmark, with 41 projects underway, 6 of which are psychiatric hospitals. And this is a lot considering the fact that the previous hospital was built in 1915. So there's very much this notion that we or they are building for psychiatry for the future. So they've really been thinking kind of in imaginaries of how can we consider the future of psychiatric treatment. And because there isn't kind of one building type at play, architects have been given quite a lot of freedom to define and design how and with which means they might make the future of psychiatry manifest in built form. So of course it's designed to make a difference. And it's based on the idea that the built environment does indeed have a positive impact on patient experiences, recovery, and psychiatric work. What I found interesting is that many ideas from earlier mental health facilities seem very much to have been reinvigorated in the language and in the design of current hospital designs. So for instance, the idea that nature is restorative, that social encounters support personal recovery. And I've liked to think about this as a kind of synthesis of functional demands and sensory impressions, producing what we might with the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk call a new alphabet of form. So kind of folding very, very contemporary ideas about evidence-based design together with very old ideas about the restorative properties of nature and folding it all together in one new building. So what is specific about the building in Slagelse isn't that it only builds on the notion of healing architecture, but it tries to translate key notions from the recovery paradigm into built form. And for that reason, it's been considered kind of a vanguard, and it's becoming a standard for hospital designs within the area. Recently, I was approached by a group of scholars from Oxford who were very interested in making something similar in the UK. So it is very much kind of a narrative about architecture that travels internationally, which is very different from the narrative that medical professionals describe around it. So let me just show you 4 design principles that the architects developed early on in the design phase. So they had the notion of healing architecture and recovery as kind of an umbrella term. So healing architecture being based on notions from evidence-based design with color and lighting and spatial disposition being important for recovery. But also the ideas from recovery found within the recovery paradigm. So social interaction and encountering the other, as it were, together with breaking down hierarchies between them and us is kind of a way they talk about it, them being medical professionals and us being service users, that they could try to do that in spatial form. And so they have these 3 other kind of sub-principles, which are transparency and proximity between people and functions, which is very much made manifest through the use, widespread use of glass partitions. And the building, I'll show you some pictures in a moment, but it very much resembles kind of the modern office building. And the architect also explained to me in an interview that he wasn't inspired by existing mental health facilities, but rather by hotels, shopping malls, and the modern office building. So the way that the architect tries to translate these ideas of social encounters, he gets them from very different places. The third principle is generality and flexibility in each room and unit. And to my understanding, this is kind of a classical architectural proposition that there needs to be a possibility to build extra, as it were, through time. So I didn't concentrate that much on that principle. Whereas the last principle, hierarchy and spaciousness and stimuli, was a way to try to translate the trajectory of recovery into spatial form. So the way the architects translated this is by having the notion of recovery as a progressive movement through space. So beginning in the protective space of the patient room, moving slightly outwards into the semi-shared spaces of the hallway, towards the environment that's more of a social space, outside of the inpatient setting, and into society. So it's a very kind of linear way of considering recovery, that the moment of recovery happened kind of within the hospital, which I think one could problematize. So this is a quote from the architecture, from the architect, sorry. They wanted to create unity between culture, structure, behavior, and bricks. It is our belief, the architect says, that the value of the physical framework is expressed through the activities that a building supports. And I found this interesting because I guess he might have a slightly more refined understanding of architecture than Churchill had, inviting us to kind of think about the actions taking place within the building. So it was interesting to present my findings to him as well, because some of them were, of course, very surprising. So in closing, with some propositions. So what is it that healing architecture does in practice? And let me just explain some of the pictures here. So this is the outside courtyard you can see, with some greenery and a table here where patients can sit and they can enter from both ends. And this is kind of an adjacent part of the hospital, not for hospitalized patients, but patients who come in for conversations with physicians, etc. And this is a view from the patient environment into the office space. And here we just get a sense of the different color schemes. And they had a Danish poet, right? I don't remember the length of the poem, but it's kind of across the entirety of the hospital space. And it's meant to kind of stimulate reflection. Most inhabitants, both patients and staff, just kind of laughed at it because they didn't really understand it. But anyway, So healing architecture is designed to work. It's designed to promote patient recovery and healing by imagining inpatient settings as a therapeutic environment that fosters social interaction between staff and patient. But such imaginaries, which we've learned from scholarship and STS, involve very particular promises that are tied to organizational, behavioral, and in this case, specifically architectural scripts that inevitably underestimate the complexity of the social world. So coming to terms with such complexity with what healing architecture does should therefore be less a question of considering the causal relationships between architectural properties such as light, spatial disposition, etc., and more about the ongoing, sometimes precarious, but always situated processes of ordering space and interaction in and through psychiatric practice, which is my claim, at least. So this leaves us in the kind of precarious situation that proposing a definitive answer to the question what healing architecture does is, in a sense, moot, because it depends on the way it's picked up and used as a resource in and through practice. So finally, the sense and significance of spaces are a situated achievement that operates outside the existing powers and calculation of architects and designers. They are instead contingent upon the activities that go on within them. Healing and recovery, therefore, will be more a function of these activities than any strict material causation. Thank you very much for listening.